You wake before the bell rings, the way you have every morning for 11 years, your hand already closed around the memory of a hilt before you remember the blade is still on its stand across the room. Frost has crept along the inside of the paper screen. Somewhere past the barracks wall a horse shifts its weight in the dark, and a single crow tries the cold air and gives up. It is the 1560s, and you are a samurai in the service of the Takeda house inside a wooden fortress manor called Tsutsujigasaki in the mountain province of Kai. You did not choose your lord any more than you chose your name. Both were given to you at birth, along with the 2 swords you will put on in a few minutes, and a debt of loyalty no rice stipend could ever fully repay. Today looks, on its surface, like every other day: drill, ledgers, a meal, a patrol. But a rider is already hours out on the northern road with news that will turn this ordinary day into something else entirely. And you will not learn that for hours yet. For now there is only the cold, the dark, and the bell that has not rung. You wake before the bell rings, in the dark, in the same instant every morning, eyes open, breath held, the cold air of Kai already numbering your ribs before you have decided to move. The barracks row where you sleep is one of a dozen long timber buildings inside the outer bank of Tsutsujigasaki, the fortified manor the Takeda house, built here in the mountain basin in 1519, and has ruled from ever since. It is not a castle in the way later ages will build them. No tall tower rises over the valley, no stone wall climbs the hillside. It is earth and timber, a moated square of packed ramparts, wooden palisades along the top, watchtowers of unpainted cedar at the corners, and inside that square, hall after low hall of retainers, grooms, cooks and clerks, arranged by rank the way everything here is arranged by rank. Your row sits 2 banks of houses back from the lord's own residence, close enough to be summoned in minutes, far enough to know your place. 6 other men share this room with you, all of them sworn to the Takeda the same way you are, all of them awake now for the reason you are. The body learns a schedule and keeps it, bell or no bell. Somewhere across the ramparts a rooster tries and fails to convince anyone that dawn has arrived. It has not. The sky through the paper of the shoji screen is the flat grey of true night, and the brazier that warmed the room until midnight burned itself out hours ago. So the first thing your hand does every morning, before your eyes have even focused, is check that the 2 swords on their low lacquered stand by the wall are exactly where you left them. They are. They are always where you left them, because a samurai, a bushi bound by service to his lord, who cannot account for his blades before he can account for anything else, has already failed at the one duty that makes him what he is. The stand holds them crosswise, the long katana above the shorter wakizashi, both still in their scabbards, both catching a thin line of grey light along the black lacquer. You do not draw them yet. There will be time for the blades later. Once you are dressed, once the household is properly awake, once the day has earned them. For now they simply sit there, waiting, the way they have waited every night of your adult life, and the way they will wait, you understand without needing to say it to yourself, until the night you do not come back to put them down. The men around you stir one by one, the way water finds its own level. No one gives an order this early, and no one needs one. A retainer named Genzo, older than you by 15 years and scarred along one forearm from a skirmish he rarely mentions, is already folding his sleeping mat with the flat, unhurried economy of a man who has folded 10,000 mats. He nods at you, you nod back. Conversation at this hour is a luxury the cold does not permit. Outside, in the black corridor between the barracks rows, a temple bell somewhere within the manor grounds finally does what the rooster could not. It tolls once, low and long, the sound rolling out over the ramparts and the moat and the dark rooftops of the castle town beyond, and by the time the note has faded, every man in Kai who serves the Takeda house is on his feet. This is the first of the bell's tolls you will hear today, and it will not be the last. It marks the hours here the way nothing else does, indifferent to rank, indifferent to what any particular morning holds. For most of the men waking to it, today is a day like every other. For you, though you do not know it yet, it is the last ordinary bell before an extraordinary one. You do not know that. What you know, standing in the cold with your breath showing white in front of your face, is simpler. The fire needs restarting, the mat needs folding, and somewhere across the compound a captain is already awake, and will expect every man in this row present, dressed, and armed inside the hour. A samurai's morning does not begin with reflection. It begins with the body doing what it was trained since childhood to do without being asked, and only later, once the hands are already moving, does the mind catch up and remember what all of this discipline is actually for. You reach for the underlayer that will go on first, and begin. The washing water in the stone basin behind the barracks is cold enough to sting, and you use it anyway, because a retainer who appears before his captain unwashed insults the captain as much as himself. You strip to the waist in the grey half-light and scrub with a folded cloth, working fast against the chill, and by the time you are done your skin has gone from numb to simply cold, which counts, in Kai in the last weeks of autumn, as an improvement. The hair comes next, and it takes longer than the washing. You shave the crown of your scalp, the sakayaki, the way you have shaved it since your coming-of-age ceremony as a boy, dragging a small blade carefully across skin you cannot see, working by feel alone. What hair remains at the sides and back you gather, oil and bind into the top knot, the chomage, that every man of any standing in this compound wears folded forward over the shaved crown. It is not vanity. Under a heavy iron helmet in the field, the shaved crown keeps a man's head cooler, and the padded top knot cushions the crown of the helmet against the skull. The style that marks you as a warrior on a peaceful morning in Kai is the same style built, generations ago, for a day exactly like the one already riding towards you on the northern road, though you do not know that yet. Genzo, dressing beside you, ties his own top knot one-handed without looking, the way a man ties something he has tied 10,000 times. Before the blades go back onto your hip, custom requires one more small check. You draw the katana a hand's width from its scabbard, no further, just enough to see a sliver of the polished steel catch the grey light, and run your eye along the edge for any fleck of rust the damp barracks air might have raised overnight. Genzo does the same beside you without needing to be told, an oiled cloth passed once along the exposed steel before the blade slides home again. It is a small motion done in seconds, and every man in this compound who has ever let a blade rust past the point of a swordsmith's quiet repair has paid for the lapse, in a captain's disapproval, sharp enough that no one repeats the mistake twice. You dress in layers the way the cold and the custom both demand. The underlayer first, then the kosode, a plain robe of undied hemp too coarse for a lord's table but entirely correct for a working morning, belted close, and over it the wide-legged hakama, pleated and stiffened, that lets a man kneel, walk, and draw a blade without the cloth catching at his knees. Rank in the Takeda household is legible at a glance, in the weave and dye of what a man is permitted to wear, and yours as a retainer of modest standing is plain, undyed hemp, a family crest, the 4 linked diamonds of the Takeda mon stitched small at the shoulder, and nothing else to mark you out from any of the other few hundred men getting dressed in barracks, rose exactly like this one across the compound, this same grey morning. Only then, dressed and belted, do you go to the stand and take up the blades. You lift the wakizashi first and slide it through your obi at your left hip, edge upward, the shorter blade that never leaves your side, indoors or out, day or night, the one you would use at close quarters, or should the day ever demand it of you, to end your own life with the discipline the code expects. Then the katana, longer, heavier, worn edge up beside it, the two together forming the paired set, the daisho, that the law of this age reserves for men of your class alone. A farmer or a merchant, however wealthy, may not wear this pair. A samurai without it is, in the eyes of every other samurai in Kai, not fully dressed at all, whatever else he has put on. You settle the swords into the obi, adjust the hang until the weight sits the way 11 years of habit tells you it should sit, and only then do you feel, in some wordless way you have never bothered to examine, that the day has actually begun. The blades are not decoration. They are the visible edge of an entire arrangement. A lord who feeds and houses you, a rank that dresses you exactly as it dresses every other retainer of your standing, and a duty that the steel at your hip exists to make good on, whenever it is called for and for as long as you live to answer the call. Outside, the barracks row is emptying toward the yard where the morning muster will be called, and you fall into step behind Genzo, the cold air sharper now that the sky has begun, at its furthest edge, to grey towards something that might, eventually, be called morning. Breakfast is rice, plain and unsalted, ladled from a communal pot into your own bowl, with a single pickled plum, an umeboshi, pressed into the centre of it for sourness, and a small square of fermented soybean paste stirred into hot water on the side. It is not a meal built for pleasure. It is a meal built for calculation, the same calculation that underwrites the entire order you serve, and this morning spooning rice into your mouth in the cold common hall, with 40 other retains doing the same, and you can feel that calculation in every grain. The Takeda house, like every warlord's house across the islands in this age, measures wealth, land, and a man's own worth to his lord in one unit, The koku, roughly the volume of rice reckoned to feed one adult for a year. A great retainer might be granted an income of several thousand koku, drawn from villages assigned to him, enough to arm and feed a company of foot soldiers of his own. A modest man of your standing draws far less, delivered twice a year from the storehouse in raw rice or its measured equivalent, and from that allotment comes everything. Your share of the bowl in front of you, the cloth on your back, the fodder for any horse you are permitted to keep, and whatever is left over to send home to the family that carries your name. Land itself in Kai has been surveyed and reckoned this same way for a generation, so that a village, a domain and a single retainer's worth can all be spoken of in the identical unit. Rice, the thing every mouth in the province actually needs, and every mouth in the province can therefore be measured against. Not every table in this hall eats quite the same bowl. Senior officers, seated nearer the hall's inner end, take their rice with a strip of dried fish included most mornings, a small unremarked privilege of rank that no one begrudges them, since a man who commands a company in the field eats what his officers eat, and is watched by every man under him for exactly that consistency. Your own table receives fish perhaps twice a week, more if the last campaign's plunder was generous, less in a lean season, and no one here would think to complain, because the alternative, the meal an Ashigaru conscript eats in his own separate mess beyond the wall, thinner rice and no fish at all most days, is a plainer reminder still of exactly where the koku ledger places every mouth in this household. Genzo, across the table, eats without comment, the way he does most things, but an older retainer beside him, a man called Toyama, who has served the house since before you were born, mutters something about the harvest this year, running short on 2 of the villages assigned to his stipend, and about a clerk in the tax hall who will have to be persuaded, this coming month, that the shortfall is the weather's doing, and not his own. It is the kind of complaint you hear often at this table and rarely anywhere else, because a samurai's income is not a fixed wage handed down from some treasury. It rises and falls with the same rains and blights that trouble any farmer, filtered through ledgers. You will spend part of this very afternoon helping to keep. The same figure that fills your bowl also answers a harder question the Takeda house never stops asking itself: how many spears this domain can actually put in the field, and for how long? A lord's total koku, once his own household's needs and his retainer's stipends are subtracted, converts by rough custom into a mobilization capacity. So many soldiers armed and fed for so many weeks of campaign, and every clerk in the tax hall down the corridor understands that a shortfall, like the one Toyama complained of this morning, is never only a shortfall in one retainer's private income. It is a shortfall, however small, in the number of men Kai could send north tomorrow if the order ever came, which is one more reason the ledgers get checked twice rather than once. It would be easy, watching the mist rise off 40 bowls of plain rice in a cold hall before dawn, to imagine that the sword is the whole of what a samurai is. It is not. The sword is what you are for. The rice is what you live on, and the rice comes from land, and the land comes from a lord's favour, recorded and re-recorded in ledgers, and the whole arrangement, blade and bowl together, is the actual shape of the life you are living. You finish the bowl, set it down, and rise with the others, already thinking less about breakfast than about the muster ground, where the captain will read the day's assignments and the koku, for one more morning, will translate itself quietly back into duty. The muster ground is the flat swept yard between the barracks rows and the inner bank where the Lord's own hall stands, and by the time you reach it the sky has lightened just enough to show its edges, packed earth, raked smooth each evening by men whose whole duty is raking it, bordered on 3 sides by low wooden verandas where the captains stand to call the names. A pair of standard bearers work along the yard's edge as the ranks settle, unfurling the taller banners from where they were furled against the night's damp, and running the halyards up through iron rings fixed to the palisade posts, a duty assigned by rotation to junior mounted retainers eager for the visibility it brings before the captains. The banners rise slowly in the still air, and for a moment before the wind finds them properly they hang nearly flat, more like painted boards than moving cloth, which some of the older men in the yard consider a poor omen for the day, and just as many consider nothing at all beyond a still morning. Banners planted along the yard's far edge stir faintly in the cold air, each one carrying the same mark, 4 diamonds linked into a single cross design, the Takeda bishi, that appears on every piece of cloth and iron this house owns, from the humblest retainer's shoulder to the war banner that will fly, when it flies, over the Lord himself. You fall into your place in the ranked lines the way every man here falls into his place, without needing to be told, because the order of the muster ground is the order of the whole household made visible. Mounted retainers of higher standing nearer the veranda, foot retainers like yourself further back, and beyond them in their own separate ranks, the ashigaru, the conscripted foot soldiers drawn from the villages, who are armed and drilled by the house but who are not, and will never be, samurai themselves. It is not a line anyone has to think about. You have stood in it in some version since before you could grow a proper beard, and you know exactly which men stand ahead of you and which stand behind, and why. A captain, a senior retainer named I, whose family has served the Takeda for 3 generations, steps out onto the veranda with a folded paper in hand and begins the roll, name by name, and against each name a task for the day: gate duty, drill, escort, the tax hall. When your name comes, he reads it without pausing, the way he reads every name, and assigns you first to the training ground for sword and spear practice, then to the tax hall through the middle hours, then to gate duty in the afternoon, then, depending on how the day runs, whatever the evening requires. It is an ordinary rotation, the kind you have drawn 100 times before. Mixing the blade you are trained for with the ledgers, a retainer of your rank is also expected to keep. Nothing in I's voice or manner suggests that today will be any different from the last one. You believe him, because there is no reason yet not to. Somewhere on the road north, a rider you cannot see and do not know exists is closing the distance between Shinano province and Kai a little more with every hour, but that distance is still measured in hours you do not have, and the muster ground this morning is exactly what it always is. Names read in order, tasks assigned by rank, banners standing still in air too cold yet to move them. A junior retainer near the front misses his footing shifting rank and earns a sharp word from I that carries the length of the yard. No one so much as turns to look. Correction here is public and brief. The way everything here is public and brief, because a household this size, this exposed, this dependent on every man doing his assigned part, has no patience for private confusion. The roll finishes, I folds the paper, the ranks break, and the yard fills with the ordinary noise of men moving off toward a dozen different duties. At once, boots on packed earth, a horse-led passed toward the stables, someone laughing at something you do not catch. You turn toward the training ground with Genzo falling in beside you, wooden practice swords already waiting in a rack there for exactly this hour, and the banners behind you settle back into stillness, 4 diamonds each, waiting for whatever this particular day decides to make of them. The training ground sits just inside the eastern rampart, a stretch of bare earth worn hard and pale by years of the same feet doing the same drills, and by the time you arrive a dozen men are already paired off, wooden swords in hand, breath showing white with every exchange. You take a bokuto, a training sword of solid oak shaped exactly to the weight and balance of the katana at your hip, but blunt enough that a full force blow lands as a bruise instead of a wound, and you find Genzo already waiting, because you have paired with Genzo at this hour more mornings than you have not. The instructor for this yard, a lean, quiet man named Hara, who holds a teaching license from a sword school, a Ryu out of the capital region, and who came into Takeda service a decade ago carrying that license as his whole introduction, does not believe in natural talent. Hara's own license came from a school out of the capital region calling itself Kage Ryu, one of a growing handful of named sword traditions whose masters have spent the last several generations codifying what used to be passed down as a single family's private habit into something closer to a shared transferable craft, complete with its own certificates and its own ranked forms. Whether one school's method is genuinely superior to another's is a question retainers argue over more heatedly than almost anything else this compound discusses, but no one in Kai disputes that a codified, drilled method beats an untrained man's instinct 9 times out of 10, which is the entire reason Hara was recruited into Takeda service in the first place, rather than left to teach paying students in some quieter province. He has said so, more than once, in the flat voice he uses for everything. Swordsmanship in his teaching is repetition organized into forms, kata, each cut and parry drilled thousands of times until the body performs it without the mind's permission, because a mind that has to decide, mid-strike, whether to cut high or low, has already lost the exchange to an opponent whose body decided before the thought arrived. You have drilled the same 8 forms with Hara for years, and you will drill them again this morning, and the fact that you already know every one of them by heart changes nothing about how carefully he will watch you perform them. He walks the line as the pairs begin, correcting a grip here, a stance there, in short economical phrases that never repeat themselves twice in the same words, though the correction itself is often the same correction he gave the same man the week before. You and Genzo work through the first form, cut and countercut, wooden blades meeting with a flat crack that echoes off the rampart behind you, and Hara stops beside you long enough to adjust the angle of your back foot, by what cannot be more than a hand's width, then moves on without comment, which you have learned over the years to read as something close to praise. The wooden blades are blunt, not harmless, and every man on this ground carries some old bruise, or in a few cases an outright broken finger from a drill gone slightly wrong, the price of practicing at something close to full speed, rather than the careful half measures that teach nothing useful. Hara has broken bones of his own over the decades, by his own rare admission, and considers the occasional injury an acceptable cost against the alternative. A swordsman whose first real experience of full-force contact comes on an actual battlefield rather than this yard. You have taken your own share of bruised knuckles under his eye over the years, and no longer think much of it, the ache, simply another part of the morning's accounting, alongside the cold and the ledgers still waiting. What strikes you, watching the yard from inside your own exertion, breath ragged now in the cold, is how little any of it resembles the stories told about swordsmen in the villages beyond the wall, tales of a single perfect stroke settling everything in an instant. The truth, drilled into your shoulders and forearms morning after morning for 11 years, is duller and more reliable than any tale. A sword fight, should it ever come to one, will very likely be decided in the first half-second by whichever man's body has drilled the correct response so many times that it no longer needs deciding at all. Talent might buy a man a slightly faster start. Repetition is what actually keeps him alive. By the time Hara calls the drill to its end, your arms ache in the particular way. That means tomorrow's drill will hurt more before it hurts less, and the wooden swords go back into their rack, in the same order they came out, blunt edges resting against blunt edges, waiting for tomorrow's cold morning to take them up again. You have perhaps an hour now before the tax hall claims you, and you use part of it, as you often do, to watch the archers already forming up at the far end of the yard, bows in hand, because the morning's drill, this early in the day, is never really finished. It only changes weapons. The archers at the far end of the yard stand in a loose line before a row of straw targets, and you join them for the second half of the morning's drill the way you have joined every morning's drill since you were old enough to be trusted with a full-sized bow. Kyujutsu, the art of the bow, is older than almost anything else this household teaches, older than the Takeda name itself, and it still carries a prestige the newer weapons cannot quite match. A man who can put an arrow through a target at full gallop, the horse's stride timed against the release the way generations of mounted archers before him timed it, is admired here in a way no spearman, however deadly, is admired. You draw, hold and release. The bowstrings slap against your leather brace loud in the cold air, and the arrow buries itself a hand's width off the target centre, which earns you a small nod from the archery instructor and nothing more. The bow itself, the Yumi, is built longer than a man is tall and strung asymmetrically. The grip set roughly a third of the way up its length rather than at the centre, the way a simpler bow from the mainland might be built, a design that lets a mounted archer clear the shaft past his horse's neck, without the lower limb striking the animal's shoulder on the release. Bowyers who understand the lamination of bamboo, wood and lacquer, needed to build one that survives a hard draw without splitting are rarer than swordsmiths in Kai. And a good Yumi, passed down through a family or won as a gift from a satisfied lord, is valued closer to the way a fine blade is valued than the way any other tool in this compound is valued. The respect the bow commands, though, has begun to outrun its usefulness, and everyone on this training ground over the age of 30 knows it, even if no one says so where the archery instructor can hear. A bow takes years to master and a skilled archer years more to replace once lost. A spear, the yari, a straight thrusting weapon on a shaft twice a man's height, takes a season to teach a farmer's son pulled off his land and issued armour, and 100 such men, drilled to thrust and recover in unison, can hold a line that a dozen brilliant archers cannot. Archery from horseback is its own discipline again, practised on a separate stretch of ground reserved for it near the stables, where a rider at a controlled gallop times his release against a swinging target the way the old mounted archers of past generations trained for hunting as much as war, and though you have drilled it since boyhood, You have never once matched the effortless rhythm the senior mounted retainers make it look like on the rare mornings they demonstrate it for the newer men. This is the weapon of the Ashigaru ranks you saw at muster this morning, and it is, whatever the old songs say about the bow, the weapon actually deciding most fights across the islands in this decade. You move from the archery line to the spear ground once the bows are racked, and there the drill changes character entirely. Where Kenjutsu and Kyujutsu are built around the single man perfecting a single motion, spear drill here is built around dozens of men moving as one body, Ashigaru and a handful of samurai spearmen like yourself packed shoulder to shoulder, shafts lowered in unison on the instructor's call, the whole line lunging forward together with a sound like a single held breath finally released. A spear thrust badly aimed by one man in isolation is a mistake. The same mistake made inside a 100-man line, where your shaft is meant to occupy exactly the gap your neighbour's does not, can open that gap to whatever is coming through it, and so the drill repeats the same simple thrust and recover, over and over, until the whole line moves as though it shares one set of muscles. A young Ashigaru near the end of your row, new enough to the drill that his timing still lags a half beat behind everyone else's, catches the instructor's sharp correction twice in the space of 10 thrusts, and you recognise, watching him flush and recover his stance, something of your own first months on this same ground years ago. The distance between an untrained farmer and a passable spearman, you have come to understand, is far shorter than the distance between an untrained boy and a passable swordsman, and that difference, more than any single weapon's virtue, is the real reason this yard now spends as much of its morning on spear drill as it once spent entirely on the bow. By the time the drill ends, the sun, such as it is this time of year, has cleared the eastern rampart, and your stomach has already begun reminding you that the tax hall and its ledgers are next. Before the tax hall there is the stable, and the stable is where you find the one animal in this compound that does not answer to rank the way every man in it does. Your horse, a compact, thick-necked gelding bred in these same Kai uplands and assigned to you 3 years ago, when your standing rose enough to warrant one, does not care that a captain outranks you or that Ice family has served the Takeda for 3 generations. He cares whether you are the hand that feeds him, and this morning, as every morning you are, so he pushes his head into your chest hard enough to stagger you before you have even opened the feed sack. The stable master, a quiet man who answers to no rank on the training ground, but commands total authority within these walls, selects young horses for retainers like yourself according to criteria that have little to do with a courtly notion of a fine mount. A broad chest, a calm eye under sudden noise, and legs that have already proven themselves sound over a season of rough upland pasture before the animal is ever brought down to the compound for training. Beauty counts for very little in his judgment, and more than one retainer has watched a plain, thick-necked gelding like your own outlast a taller, more elegant horse purchased from a western trader within a single hard campaign season, exactly the kind of practical lesson that keeps Kai's cavalry riding the same sturdy stock generation after generation, rather than chasing fashion from the capital region. Kai's mountains are poor country for rice, which is half of why the Koku ledgers you will spend the coming hours updating are argued over so bitterly each harvest. But they are good country for horses, steep upland pastures toughening a breed smaller and shaggier than the elegant animals painted in courtly scrolls, built instead for endurance over broken ground rather than speed on a flat road. It is this stock, and the men who have spent generations learning to ride it hard through mountain passes other domains would consider impassable, that has given Takeda cavalry its name across the provinces, not the largest force in the field by most accounts, but among the most feared because a Takeda horseman comes at a pace and over ground an enemy has usually assumed no mounted force could manage. You check the gelding's legs and hooves the way you check your own blades, by feel and by habit, running a hand down each leg for the heat that would mean strain or injury, lifting each hoof to clear the packed dirt and check the shoe. A samurai who neglects his horse in peacetime is a samurai who discovers, at the worst possible hour, that the one piece of equipment he cannot replace on short notice has gone lame beneath him. The grooms who work this stable full-time, men of lower standing whose whole duty is exactly this care, would tend to the animal regardless, but a mounted retainer who never touches his own horse except to ride it is, in the unspoken judgment of every stable hand in Kai, not much of a horseman at all. You lead the gelding out to the yard behind the stable for a short working exercise, not full drill, just enough to keep both of you sharp between the mornings you actually ride in formation, and for a few minutes the compound narrows to nothing but the animal's gait beneath you, the cold air moving past, the particular quiet of a horse's attention fixed entirely on the ground in front of it. Bujutsu, horsemanship, is its own discipline here, taught as carefully as the sword, because a mounted charge delivered by riders who cannot control their animals under noise and blood is a charge that kills its own side as readily as the enemy's, and every mounted retainer in this household has drilled that lesson into muscle memory, long before he is trusted to ride in a real formation. Full mounted formation drill, dozens of riders wheeling and reforming together at speed, happens only twice a week rather than daily, since horses tire of repetition as readily as men do, and a mount ridden hard every single morning arrives at an actual campaign already half worn down before the enemy is even in sight, a lesson every cavalry officer in this domain has learned the costly way at least once in his career. You walk the gelding back to his stall, rub him down and leave him to the grain the grooms have already measured out, and only as you are crossing the yard back toward the inner compound do you notice how much higher the sun has climbed while you were occupied with an animal that has never once, in 3 years, cared what any of it meant. The tax hall is waiting, and unlike the horse, it will absolutely notice if you are late. The tax hall is a long, low building near the inner gate, its shelves lined with wooden boxes of paper and its floor, at this hour already covered with retainers of your rank and clerks of no martial rank at all, kneeling at low writing desks with brush and ink close at hand. Nobody here wears a sword drawn or bare, though every samurai present still carries his daisho at his side out of habit and law alike. The work of this room has nothing to do with blades and everything to do with columns of figures that, mismanaged, could put more of this domain at risk than any single lost skirmish. The paper the returns are written on comes dear, pressed and traded up from workshops further south, and a clerk who wastes a sheet on a miscalculation redoes his sum in the narrow margin, rather than reaching for a fresh one. Ink itself ground fresh each morning, from a hard stick against a stone well, a small daily ritual every literate man in this hall learned as a boy alongside the strokes of his own name. Most of the clerks working this room came up through exactly the kind of temple schooling any samurai's son receives, though a few, promoted for a sharp hand and a sharper memory for figures, hold no sword rank at all and answer only to the senior clerk, a rare arrangement in a household this rank-conscious, tolerated because the tax hall's actual usefulness has never once depended on whether the man holding the brush was also permitted to hold a blade. A senior clerk, a man whose entire career has been ink and paper rather than iron, hands you a stack of village returns to check against the standing survey, the record of exactly how much rice-yielding land each village under Takeda authority holds and what it therefore owes in tax and labour. This survey, revised and re-revised for a generation now, is what lets the house translate a scattering of mountain villages into the same koku figures that filled your bowl this morning, and will fill the war chest if war comes. You have done this work often enough that the columns no longer swim in front of your eyes the way they did your first year, and you settle in to compare this season's returns against last year's, flagging the shortfalls Toyama complained of at breakfast, and noting, in the careful clerk's hand every literate retainer here is expected to have learned as a boy exactly where each discrepancy falls. The domain's own law, a code the Lord himself has had compiled and revised over the better part of 2 decades, sits on a shelf at the hall's far end for exactly this kind of dispute, article after article covering land boundaries, irrigation rights, the conduct expected of samurai in and out of service, and the punishments due when any of it is violated. You have read enough of it over the years to know that it treats a farmer's water rights complaint with almost the same procedural seriousness it gives a retainer's misconduct, because a domain that cannot settle its own internal disputes without every grievance escalating into a private feud is a domain that cannot field an army when it actually needs one. Order in the tax hall, it turns out, is not so different from order on the training ground. Rules drilled the same way every time, so that no one has to improvise a response in the moment a dispute actually arrives. A runner interrupts the quiet scratch of brushes twice during the morning, once with a routine message for the senior clerk, once later with something that makes the clerk's expression change for just a moment before he composes it again, and continues his own work without comment. You do not think much of it at the time. Runners cross this hall a dozen times a day, most of them carrying nothing more urgent than a question about seed grain. and you are 3 columns deep into a shortfall in a village you have never visited and will likely never see. You finish the stack before midday, hand it back to the clerk with your notes attached, and rise from the low desk with the particular stiffness that comes from an hour kneeling over figures rather than swinging a wooden sword, thinking, as you often do at the end of this duty, that the songs sung about men like you in the villages beyond the wall never once mention a ledger. They should. You have spent nearly as many hours of your service life at a writing desk as you have on a training ground, and both, in their own way, are what keeps the whole arrangement from coming apart. The gate you are assigned to for the early afternoon sits where the road out of the castle town narrows, between 2 guardhouses, a checkpoint, a sekisho, manned in shifts around the clock by retainers of your rank, paired with a clerk who keeps the day's passage log. You take your position beside a low wooden barrier that can be swung shut in a moment, and for the first while the duty is exactly what gate duty almost always is. Watching a thin, ordinary trickle of the domain's business pass back and forth in front of you. The barrier itself is a simple counterweighted pole, easily raised or lowered by a single man, but its real authority lies less in the wood than in the logbook chained to the guardhouse desk. Every name, cargo, and origin recorded in a hand any later inspector could check against a village's own declared harvest, a system that makes wholesale evasion difficult even for a determined smuggler, since a discrepancy caught weeks later at the tax hall points straight back to the gate that let it through. Tolls here run modest, a fraction of a cargo's declared value paid in coin or in kind, enough to fund the checkpoint's own upkeep and the wages of the men manning it, and few travellers complain of the rate itself so much as the delay, which on a market day can back a short line of carts nearly to the edge of the town proper. A farmer leads an ox cart loaded with charcoal through, his travel permit, a folded paper stamped by his village headman, already out and ready before you even ask for it, because every soul in Kai who travels between villages learns early that the sekisho wants its paper shown without argument. A peddler with a rack of needles and thread on his back gets a longer look, his goods checked against the tolls he claims to have already paid at the last gate, and a pair of Buddhist pilgrims, bound for a mountain temple, pass through with barely a glance. Their staffs and worn sandals answer enough to their purpose. None of it is dramatic. Most of what a sekisho actually stops is smuggled rice avoiding the tax rolls you were checking this morning, or a runaway labourer trying to slip out from under a debt, or simply information moving faster than the Lord would prefer it to. A boy leading a string of pack horses loaded with raw silk cocoons argues briefly with Sato over a toll he insists he already paid at the previous crossing, and Sato, unmoved, checks the log from that gate against the boy's own claim before waving him through anyway, the discrepancy apparently an honest clerk's error, 2 gates back rather than any attempt at evasion, the kind of small daily friction the sekisho exists to sort out long before it hardens into a real grievance. That last part matters more than the farmers and peddlers usually let on. A domain at peace with its neighbours can afford to let travellers carry gossip freely from one province to the next. A domain watching a rival across its northern border cannot, and the clerk beside you, a careful, unsmiling man named Sato, has grown noticeably more particular this past week about anyone coming down from the direction of Shinano, asking where they have been and what they have seen with a patience that is really a kind of thoroughness. You have not thought much about why, until now, standing at the barrier with the cold wind, finding its way under your collar and watching Sato wave through a merchant while asking him, almost as an afterthought, whether the roads north of the border have seen unusual traffic this month. The merchant, eager to be on his way, says only that he heard talk of soldiers moving near the border villages, though he saw none himself, and Sato notes it in his log the way he notes everything, without visible reaction, and lets the man pass. You file the exchange away without much weight, because merchants trade in rumour the way farmers trade in charcoal, and a sekisho hears a dozen half-formed rumours for everyone that turns out to matter. Still, walking the length of the barrier to stretch legs gone stiff with standing, you find yourself glancing north along the road more than the duty strictly requires, toward hills that from here look exactly as quiet as they did this morning. The afternoon wears on in this same rhythm, permits checked, tolls confirmed, the ordinary traffic of a province at peace passing through a gate built, in the end, for exactly the kind of morning that has not yet arrived. You will not know, standing here with the cold working into your feet, that the rider closer is quietly watching. For now, the gate does what the gate always does. and you do what a guard at a gate always does, which is wait and watch, and let very little through unremarked. The shouting reaches the gate before the runner does, carrying down the narrow street from the direction of the market square, and Sato sends you toward it with a short nod that needs no further instruction. A guard posted at the Sekisho is also, by unwritten custom, the nearest available authority for whatever trouble the town itself throws up between one patrol and the next. You leave the barrier to a junior man and walk fast, hand resting near the wakizashi rather than the katana, because whatever this is, it has not yet earned the longer blade. By the time you reach the square, two men, a cloth merchant and a labourer, who by the look of the split baskets between them had been arguing over a cart's right of way, are past shouting and into shoving, a small crowd already gathering, with the particular stillness of people who want to watch a fight but not be blamed for starting one. Neither man has drawn anything sharper than his fists, which is the only reason you are not currently drawing your own blade. You step between them, plant a hand flat against each man's chest, and use the flat, carrying voice every retainer here is trained to use in exactly this situation, the voice that assumes it will be obeyed because it has never yet been tested by not being obeyed. Both men subside, more from the shock of a samurai suddenly between them than any words you actually said, and you separate them by a full body's length before either can decide the fight is worth continuing in front of you. The crowd's attention shifts from the fighters to you, which is precisely the point of stepping in fast. A dispute contained quickly is a dispute that ends here, in the square, rather than spreading into the kind of feud between two families that can poison a neighbourhood for a generation. What you tell both men next, and what every retainer on this duty tells men in their position, is not a judgment about who started it. The domain's own law, the code you were checking references against only this morning in the tax hall, applies a simple and deliberately harsh principle to exactly this kind of quarrel. Kenka ryoseibai, both sides punished regardless of which man's fist moved first. It sounds unjust to a stranger hearing it for the first time, and more than one merchant has said so loudly enough for you to hear. But its purpose is not fairness in the moment, it is the removal of any reason to fight in the first place. If striking the first blow carries no advantage over striking second, because both men answer to the magistrate all the same, then a man with a genuine grievance has every incentive to bring it to a clerk's writing desk, instead of settling it with his fists in a public square, and a domain that has watched private feuds burn through whole villages in living memory has decided that trade-off is worth making. You march both men, still glaring past you at each other, toward the magistrate's office near the inner gate, where a clerk will record the complaint, assess whatever modest fine or labour penalty the code prescribes for a market brawl of this size, and send them both back to their work by evening, aggrieved perhaps but no poorer in blood than they arrived. The crowd disperses almost as quickly as it gathered. The split baskets of cloth and vegetables get sorted out between the two men's apprentices, with considerably less shouting than the original quarrel. The market square itself, when it is not hosting a shoving match between a cloth merchant and a labourer, is the liveliest stretch of the castle town outside the gate you left behind. Stalls of dried fish, woven straw goods, and dyed and undyed bolts of cloth packed close along both sides of the open ground, and the crowd that gathered to watch the fight disperses back into that same ordinary bustle. Almost the moment the excitement ends, a testament to how quickly this town has learned to absorb its own small frictions and move on. The magistrate's clerk who will log the complaint works from a standing desk just inside the inner gate, a position chosen, old hands say, specifically, so that every merchant hauled in for a dispute walks past the tax hall's open doors on the way, a quiet reminder that the same house keeping the peace also keeps the ledgers, and that neither duty forgives the other. And you are left, walking back toward the gate, with the small familiar satisfaction of a duty performed exactly as it was meant to be performed, quietly, before it could become something worse. You have barely reached the Sekisho again before Sato tells you, without much preamble, that word has come in while you were gone, and that the magistrate wants every gate retainer back inside the inner compound before the midday bell finishes tolling. The bell finishes its midday toll as you cross back through the inner gate, and the compound you re-enter feels subtly different from the one you left this morning, though nothing about it has visibly changed. More men are moving through the yard than the hour usually holds, gate retainers and drill instructors and clerks, all converging on the same open space near the tax hall, and the magistrate himself, a broad, unhurried man named Kojima, who rarely leaves his own office before dusk, is standing on the veranda addressing the gathering crowd in the same flat procedural voice he uses for tax disputes. What he tells you is less than you expect and more than nothing. A report has reached the compound unconfirmed. That movement has been seen near the border with Shinano, the neighbouring province where the rival Uesugi domain holds sway, and until scouts return with something more definite than a merchant's second-hand rumour, every retainer is to remain within easy call of the inner compound rather than scattered across the castle town on ordinary errands. It is not, Kojima is careful to say, a call to arms. It is prudence, the same prudence that keeps a well-run household counting its koku twice rather than once. You have heard recalls like this before, 3 or 4 times in your years of service, and every one of them so far has ended by evening, with the scouts reporting nothing worse than a hunting party or a merchant caravan mistaken, at a distance, for something more sinister. Still, the mood in the hall where the midday meal is served, an hour later carries a texture the morning's breakfast did not. Conversation runs lower and faster, men leaning toward each other over their rice instead of eating in the usual companionable silence, and more than one retainer near you finds an excuse to touch the hilt of his sword without quite seeming to notice he is doing it. Genzo, seated across from you again, eats with the same unhurried economy as always, but you notice he has positioned himself, as he always does without comment, where he can see the hall's main entrance. Near the veranda, an attendant is preparing something else entirely. A small charcoal brazier, a black iron kettle, a stoneware bowl and a bamboo whisk, laid out with a precision that has nothing hurried about it. It is chanoyu, the way of tea, a practice that has been climbing in fashion among warlords and their senior retainers these past years, popularized in part by tea masters serving the great households further west, men whose skill at whisking a bowl of powdered leaf into something worth drinking has made them valued guests at courts that would never think to invite a common merchant to dinner. The attendant is preparing a bowl for one of the Lord's senior councillors, a man who by all accounts finds the slow exact motions of the tea preparation, the warming of the bowl, the careful measure of water, a useful discipline for a mind that spends most of its hours weighing reports of exactly the kind now circulating through this hall. You have never been offered a bowl yourself, and are not likely to be at your rank, but you watch the whisk turn in the bowl for a moment anyway, and something about its patience against the room's low, anxious hum settles you slightly more than the rice does. The bowl itself, when the attendant finally presents it, is a plain, faintly irregular piece of dark stoneware, deliberately unglamorous by the standard courtly taste from a generation ago would have demanded, a preference some tea masters out of the capital have begun calling wobby, a kind of quiet, imperfect beauty that values a single honest bowl over a shelf of gilded ones, and that has found, oddly enough, a riddier audience than among hardened warlords who might be expected to prize refinement most. The councillor turns the bowl once in his hands before drinking, examining its glaze the way he might examine a report, and sets it down again with the same unhurried care, the whole small ceremony taking perhaps as long as the anxious hall around him takes to finish an entire meal. By the time the meal ends, no further word has come, and Kojima has not returned to the veranda to say more. The recall stands, which means your afternoon duties in the tax hall and at study will continue as assigned, but within the compound rather than out at the gate, and every man rising from the tables carries the same unspoken understanding. Today has not yet decided what kind of day is going to be, and until it does, the household will simply keep doing what it always does, one ordinary task after another, and wait. With the gate closed to you for the afternoon, your assignment shifts to a room you visit less often than the training ground or the tax hall. A quiet study chamber attached to the small Zen temple inside the compound's inner bank, where a monk named Eshun has taught calligraphy and the classics to Takeda retainers, young and not so young, for longer than anyone currently kneeling at these low writing desks has been alive. You take your place with 4 other men, none of them under the recall's restriction for reasons of their own rank or duty, and Eshun sets in front of you a passage from the Confucian classics, copied out in a clean, disciplined hand you are meant to reproduce stroke for stroke. This too is training, though it uses none of the muscles the sword ground uses. Reading and writing are not universal skills among the Ashigaru ranks drilling with spears this same afternoon, most of whom will never need more literacy than recognizing their own name on a pay ledger, but they are expected, without much discussion, of every samurai of your standing, because a retainer who cannot read an order, draft a report, or make sense of the domain's own law code is a retainer whose usefulness stops entirely at the edge of a battlefield. Eshin does not teach calligraphy as decoration. He teaches it the same way Hara teaches the sword form, as repetition that eventually becomes instinct. The brush trained to hold a line as steady as a blade is trained to hold an edge. The classics themselves, translated and studied here the way they are studied in halls across the mainland-facing coast, deal mostly in obligation, a ruler's duty to govern well, a subject's duty to serve loyally, a son's duty to his father, each relationship binding two people together through a debt neither can simply walk away from. Eshin reads a passage aloud, on the proper conduct of a retainer toward a lord who has treated him honourably, and though the text is centuries old and was written for a very different court in a very different country, no one in the room finds it difficult to see their own mourning, and their own oath reflected in it. You copy the passage twice, the second attempt cleaner than the first, and Eshin's only comment, passing behind you, is a small correction to the angle of your final stroke, delivered with exactly the same economy Hara uses on the training ground. Eshin's teaching moves between two traditions that sit more comfortably together in this room than a stranger might expect. The Confucian classics for their lessons in duty and right conduct between ruler and subject, father and son, and the Zen discipline of the temple itself for the quieter wordless training of a mind that does not flinch, does not rush, and does not need constant instruction to know what it is doing. A retainer who has sat long enough under Eshin's teaching learns to recognize the same stillness in both, the brush held steady through a whole character without the hand once hesitating, and the mind held steady through a whole crisis without once needing to be told what to do next, are, in Eshin's own quiet phrase, closer to the same skill than most swordsmen ever bother to notice. The inkstone in front of you, a plain dark stone worn smooth in its centre by generations of students grinding the same stick of solid ink against a few drops of water, is older, Eshin says without much ceremony, than the temple building around it, passed down the way a good sword might be passed down, valued for what it has helped teach, rather than for anything ornamental about the stone itself. Outside the study chamber's paper walls, you can hear faintly the ordinary sounds of a compound still waiting on word from the north, footsteps crossing the yard a little faster than usual, a horse being led somewhere at a trot rather than a walk, voices pitched low in the particular way. Voices go low when men do not want to be overheard worrying aloud. None of it enters the room directly. Eshin's teaching does not pause for rumour any more than the sword drill this morning paused for the cold, and there is something in that steadiness, in a monk correcting a brushstroke while the whole compound holds its breath over a report from the border, that you find yourself grateful for without quite examining why. By the time the session ends, your hand aches faintly from holding the brush the correct way for the better part of an hour, a different ache from the sword arm's ache this morning, but recognisably a cousin of it, and you fold your practice sheets and rise with the others, no wiser about the border than you were when you sat down, but a little steadier in yourself for the hour spent proving that some disciplines run on, regardless of what the day around them decides to become. The recall does not empty, the Lord's own schedule so much as compress it, and word comes to the study chamber shortly after the session ends that a small party is wanted in the inner garden within the hour, you among them, to attend the Lord during a short flight of his hawks. It is, on any ordinary afternoon, one of the more pleasant duties a retainer of your rank can draw. Today, given everything the morning and midday have already carried, it feels instead like a test of composure disguised as a pastime, and you suspect, walking toward the garden, that this may be exactly the Lord's intention. The hawk himself, a goshawk taken as a nestling, and trained over 2 full seasons by a falconer whose entire standing in this household rests on that single skill, wears jesses of soft leather at his legs, and a hood of dyed cloth that comes off only once he is settled calmly on the glove, a small daily ritual of trust built between bird and handler that took longer to establish, the falconer has said more than once, than most men's training with a sword. Commoners beyond the wall hunt with snares and dogs when they hunt at all, practical trades aimed at putting meat in a pot, and the gulf between that plain necessity and a lord's hawk, dropping on a pheasant for an audience of watching retainers, is, everyone present understands without needing it said, exactly the point, This is a pastime that displays what only a great house can afford to maintain: patience, training, and a bird bred for nothing more useful than looking magnificent while it kills. Falconry among households like this one is not simple leisure, whatever it might look like from a distance. A hawk trained to take game on command requires months of patient handling, the same slow, repetitive discipline the sword ground and the study chamber both depend on, and a lord skilled at reading his own bird's mood in the field is, by the same unspoken logic every retainer here absorbs early, a lord practiced at reading terrain, weather, and the fine, wordless signals of men and animals under pressure. Takeda, the hunt with hawks, doubles here as a kind of standing rehearsal for exactly the judgment a commander needs when the terrain in question is a battlefield rather than a hunting ground, and more than one retainer has said quietly that watching the lord fly his birds tells you more about his temperament under strain than watching him hold court ever could. Today's flight is shorter than usual, confined to the inner garden and the strip of scrub beyond the rampart rather than the wider hunting ground the lord would normally range across, a small concession, unremarked upon by anyone present, to the recall still standing over the whole compound. The lord himself, a compact, watchful man, whose calm this afternoon gives away nothing of whatever reports have already reached him, that have not yet reached you, sets a hawk from his wrist with the same unhurried motion he might use signing a routine order, and the bird climbs, circles once over the garden wall, and drops toward a flushed pheasant with a speed that draws a small, appreciative murmur from the gathered retainers, despite everything else weighing on the afternoon. You stand at the garden's edge among 6 or 7 other men, called for this same duty, close enough to observe the lord without being close enough to be addressed directly, which is precisely where a retainer of your rank belongs at a gathering like this. What you notice, more than the hawk itself, is how carefully every man present is reading the lord rather than the bird, the set of his shoulders, the pace of his breathing, any sign at all of the tension the rest of the compound has been carrying since midday. He gives nothing away. Whether that composure means the reports so far are as inconclusive as Kojima suggested at the muster, or simply that this is a man who has learned, over decades of rule, never to let his retainers see him afraid before he has decided fear is warranted, is not a question anyone in the garden is foolish enough to ask aloud. The hawk returns to the glove with the pheasant already limp in its talons. The lord rewards the bird with a scrap of meat kept ready in a small pouch at his belt, and the short flight ends almost as soon as it began, the party dispersing back toward their assigned duties with no more information about the border than they arrived with. You walk back toward the spear ground, turning the lord's composure over in your mind, and find it settles nothing, one way or the other, about what kind of evening this compound is heading toward. The spear ground this afternoon is fuller than it was this morning. More men called back from lighter duties to fill out the ranks, and the instructor overseeing it, a scarred veteran officer named Obata, who answers to no one below the lord himself on matters of infantry drill, runs the line with a sharper edge in his voice than the recall alone would explain. He has heard, by whatever channel senior officers hear things before the rest of the compound does, more of the morning's rumour than Kojima chose to share at muster, and though he says nothing of it directly, the drill itself says enough. More repetitions, less patience for a mistimed thrust, a line run through its paces twice as long as the usual afternoon session. Most of the Ashigaru drilling in this line were never soldiers by trade at all until the domain's levy called them up. Ordinary farmers' sons, whose villages owe a fixed quota of men to Takeda service, alongside their quota of rice, the same ledgers you checked in the tax hall this morning, translating, a step further down the same chain of obligation, into exactly how many spears Obata has to work with on a given afternoon. A domain that levies too heavily strips its own villages of the hands needed to bring in the next harvest, and a domain that levies too lightly cannot field a force worth the name, and every lord in this rivalry walks that same narrow line, adjusting the balance year by year as the fighting demands more or the fields demand more, with no formula anyone has ever written down that settles the question for good. You take your place among the mixed-rank Obata favours for this drill, samurai spearmen like yourself interspersed among the Ashigaru conscripts, rather than grouped apart, because a line's real strength, as he has told this same ground more times than anyone can count, comes from every man trusting the shaft beside his own regardless of whose family crest that man's helmet does or does not carry. On the call, The whole line lowers its yari as one motion, steps forward, and drives the thrust home into the padded targets, set along the ground's far edge, and the young Ashigaru who struggled with his timing this morning has visibly improved since then, his shaft landing within the same half beat as his neighbours for the first time you have noticed all day. Obata walks the line as it resets, correcting grips and stances the way Hara does on the sword ground, but where Hara's corrections carry the flat patience of a man teaching a skill for its own sake, Obata's carry something closer to urgency, a sense that whatever this line does or does not manage today may matter rather more than any ordinary drill usually does. The footwork Obata drills into the line matters as much as the thrust itself, each man's forward foot planted at the identical angle as his neighbour's, so that the whole rank advances and recovers as a single unit, rather than a ragged row of individuals, because a line that loses its even footing at the moment of contact opens gaps an enemy spearman needs only a heartbeat to find and exploit, and a gap in a 100-man line, once opened, tends to widen rather than close on its own. He stops beside the young Ashigaru, adjusts the angle of his rear foot with a single sharp tap, and moves on without a word, and the boy's next thrust lands cleaner than the last, the correction taking hold the way corrections tend to when a man understands without needing to be told exactly why it matters this particular afternoon. Between repetitions in the brief pause while the line resets, you catch fragments of talk passed low along the row. The same rumour Sato was chasing at the gate this morning, now travelling among men who were nowhere near that gate to hear it firsthand. Soldiers seen near the border, a report sent, scouts still out. None of it is new information exactly, only the same uncertain shape making its way further through the compound, gathering a little more weight with each retelling the way rumour always does, whether or not the facts underneath it have actually grown any firmer. The drill runs long, well past the hour it would ordinarily end, and by the time Obata finally calls it, the whole line is breathing hard, sweat cooling fast in the afternoon chill, wooden and blunted practice spears going back into their racks with none of the easy, unhurried motion the morning's session carried. You are racking your own spear, arms aching in a way that will make tomorrow's drill, should tomorrow arrive as an ordinary day, considerably harder than usual when a shout goes up from the direction of the inner gate, not urgent exactly, but pitched to carry, and every head on the spear ground turns toward it at once. The rider comes through the inner gate at a hard trot, his horse lathered enough to show it has covered real distance at real speed, and by the time he swings down in the yard a knot of officers, Obata among them, is already closing around him faster than any of the days earlier, quieter rumours ever managed to gather a crowd. You are close enough, still holding the spear you had not quite finished racking, to catch the shape of what he says even before the officers move off toward the Lord's Hall to carry it further. Scouts posted along the Shinano border have confirmed movement, not a hunting party, not a merchant caravan mistaken at a distance, but banners and men, and the particular disciplined order that means an army rather than a rabble. The banners, the rider says, carry the Uesagi crest, which settles in the space of a single sentence the question the whole compound has spent since midday carefully not asking aloud. Uesagi Kenshin, lord of Echigo to the north, and Takeda Shingen have contested the mountain province of Shinano, the buffer ground between their two domains, for years now, their rival ambitions colliding there again and again in a string of engagements fought near a river crossing called Kawanakajima, encounters that by most accounts have settled nothing permanently and guaranteed, only that the two houses will meet there again whenever either side judges the moment right. Whether Today's movement is the opening of a fresh push into that same contested ground, or a more limited raid meant to test the border's defences, is not something a single lathered rider and his scouts report can yet tell you. Uesugi Kenshin's own reputation, even among Takeda retainers who have never met the man and never care to, carries a strange double edge that the compound's talk has always found hard to resolve. A rival commander skilled enough that this house has never yet managed to settle the Shinano question by force alone, and yet, by the same accounts that name him a dangerous enemy, a man who by most reports takes an unusual interest in matters of honour for a rival lord, said even to have sent salt across the border in a past year when an enemy domain supply had been cut off elsewhere, on the reasoning that a war ought to be settled by swords rather than by starvation. Whether that story is precisely true in every detail, or has grown a little in the retelling the way every good story about a famous rival grows, no one in this yard tonight much cares to debate. What matters is simpler, Whatever kind of man leads the banners now moving towards Shinano, the men following those banners are as real and as dangerous as the men now reforming this very spear line. What it does tell you, plainly enough, is that the ordinary day you began in the cold dark of the barracks has finally, decisively, stopped being ordinary. Obata does not wait for the full report to finish travelling toward the Lord's Hall before he turns back to the spear ground and starts issuing orders of his own, and you find yourself, spear back in hand almost before you decided to pick it up again, part of a line reforming with none of the earlier drill's patient repetition, and all of its urgency compressed into motions the men around you no longer need explained. Word passes through the yard the way water finds every low place at once, gate retainers recalled fully now rather than merely restricted, armourers summoned to the equipment stores, grooms already leading strings of horses out toward the muster ground at a trot. Somewhere behind you, the temple bell tolls again, off its usual hour, 3 short strokes rather than the single long one that has marked every hour since before dawn. A signal you have heard drilled and rehearsed a dozen times without ever, until this exact moment, hearing it rung for a reason. You do not know, standing in the yard with the light already leaning toward evening, whether tonight ends in a march north or in nothing more than a longer watch on these same walls. No one around you knows either, and for a moment that uncertainty sits over the whole compound more heavily than any confirmed danger could, because a rumour half the day old at least had the mercy of being uncertain. A confirmed movement of Uesugi banners toward the border is a fact, and facts, unlike rumours, demand an answer whether or not you are ready to give one. Obata's voice cuts through the noise, ordering the line back to its ranks one final time before dismissing you to the armoury instead. And you go, spear over your shoulder, toward the low storehouse where your armour has waited untouched since the last time this same compound stood exactly where it stands now. The armoury is a long, dim storehouse smelling of oil, lacquer and old sweat, its walls lined with wooden stands each holding one man's set of armour exactly where he left it, and yours, when you find it, is precisely as you last checked it 3 months ago at the closing of the last alert, every lace and plate accounted for. Genzo is already at the stand beside yours, stripping down to his underlayer with the same unhurried economy he brings to everything, and without either of you needing to say so, you turn to help lace each other into the harder pieces neither man can properly tighten alone, the way retainers here have helped each other into armour for longer than either of your careers. Your cuirass is a Tosi Gozoku, a modern armour built from solid iron plates hinged and laced together rather than the older, more flexible lamellar construction of small individual scales bound in rows, a style that has spread through households like this one over recent decades as battles have come to involve more massed infantry and more firearms than the wars of a generation ago, and a single larger plate turns a musket ball or a spear thrust rather better than dozens of smaller ones stitched loosely together. Between alerts, this same armour spends months untouched on its stand, and the quiet work of keeping it from ruin, oiling the lacquer, checking the lacing cord for fraying, airing the padded undergarments against the damp that creeps into every storehouse in Kai, falls to a rotation of junior retainers assigned to armoury duty, precisely because it teaches, better than any lecture could, how much unglamorous maintenance stands behind a single hour of readiness. You drew that duty yourself for the better part of a year early in your service, and have never since looked at another man's poorly kept stand without a small private judgment forming, unbidden, about what kind of retainer neglects the one thing most likely to keep him alive. The lacing, the odoshi, still runs bright cord through the plates in the Takeda colours, and Genzo works it tight across your shoulders and down your side with hands that know exactly how much give to leave for movement, and how little to leave for anything else. You do the same for him in turn, checking each cord, each plate's seat against the one beside it, because armour laced carelessly in haste is armour that fails at precisely the moment it is needed most. The helmet, the kabuto, goes on last, its bowl fitted with a neck guard of overlapping plates, and, at the front, a small crest bearing, in miniature, the same 4 linked diamonds you have worn, stitched at your shoulder since dawn. You settle it, adjust the chin cord, and feel the familiar shift in balance and hearing that a helmet always brings, the world going slightly muffled and slightly narrower, exactly as it did the last time this armour came off its stand, and exactly as it will, you understand without dwelling on it, the next time and the time after that, for as many times as your service to this house requires it. Around you, the armory fills with the low, steady sound of dozens of men doing the same careful work at once, cord drawn tight, plates checked, weapons taken down from racks that have held them untouched since the last alert, and there is something in the room's unhurried thoroughness that stands against the urgency of the yard outside. Obata, moving down the row checking men as he goes, corrects a badly seated shoulder plate on a younger retainer who stands down with the same economical tap he uses on a mistimed spear thrust, and the correction takes exactly as long as it needs to and not a moment longer. War, whatever the songs claim about it, does not reward the man who arms himself fastest. It rewards the man who arms himself correctly, and every retainer in this armory has drilled that lesson into his hands, as thoroughly as he has drilled the sword forms Hara teaches at dawn. By the time you and Genzo have finished checking each other's straps a second time, the light through the armory's high, narrow windows has gone properly gold with the last of the afternoon, and a runner puts his head through the door to say that the Lord wants his senior officers, and a handful of others besides, gathered in the main hall within the hour. You do not yet know whether you are among the others besides. You finish settling your sword belt over the armor's lower plates, katana and wakizashi both back at your hip where they belong, and wait to find out. You are among the others besides, it turns out, called in not for your voice, which at your rank no one in that hall expects or particularly wants, but to stand post along the wall as the council convenes, a silent line of armoured retainers framing a room where the actual deciding will be done by men considerably senior to you. The Lord's Hall is the largest single room inside Tsutsujigasaki, its floor covered in fresh tatami mats, and at its far end, mounted on a simple stand behind where the Lord will sit, hangs the banner you have seen carried at the head of this house's forces since before you took service, a long vertical standard bearing 4 characters in bold black brushwork, Furinkazan, wind, forest, fire, mountain, words drawn from an old military text out of the mainland that describe an army as it should move, as swift as wind, as silent as forest, as fierce as fire, as immovable as mountain, depending on what the moment demands of it. The text itself arrived in Japan centuries earlier, carried across the water the way most learned texts arrived, alongside Buddhist scripture and the Confucian classics Eshun teaches in the temple school, and generations of commanders on these islands have studied it since as carefully as any lord on the mainland ever did, finding, in its short, clipped maxims a discipline that translates easily across languages because it describes not a particular army, but the shape any well-run army needs to take. Few men in this hall tonight could recite the text's fuller argument beyond the 4 words hanging behind the Lord's seat, but fewer still would dispute that those 4 words, wind, forest, fire, mountain, capture something true enough about tonight's own decision that no lengthier quotation was ever needed. The Lord takes his place at the room's head, with the same unhurried composure he showed flying his hawk in the garden this afternoon, and around him, in an order as fixed and legible as the ranks at this morning's muster, his senior retainers settle onto the mats, the councillor who took his bowl of tea at midday, Obata representing the infantry, several mounted commanders whose family names you know from a lifetime of hearing them, each man seated according to a precedence that has been argued over and settled long before any of them were born. The rider's report is read aloud in full this time, every detail Obata and the others had only in fragments now laid out plainly. Wisugi banners confirmed near the Shinano border, in numbers that suggest more than a raiding party, their exact strength and intention still unclear, the scouts continuing to watch and report. What follows is not the swift, decisive drama the songs beyond the wall like to make of moments like this. It is discussion, careful and procedural, each senior man offering his reading of the report in turn, weighing whether this is the opening move of a genuine push into Shinano, or a probing action meant to draw a response and measure it, whether the garrison here at Tsutsujigasaki should move north in strength or hold and reinforce the border posts already watching the crossing points. The Lord listens more than he speaks, the way he has listened to every report you have ever seen him receive, and only when each of his senior men has given his full opinion does he speak himself, briefly, settling the matter with a decision that sounds, by the time he states it, less like a single man's judgment than the plain conclusion the whole room's discussion was always heading toward. Reinforce the border watches at once, hold the main garrison here ready to move on a day's notice, and wait one more cycle of the scouts' reports before committing further. Standing along the wall through all of it, sword at your hip, helmet's chin cord still faintly chafing where you have not quite gotten used to its weight again after months off duty, you find yourself thinking less about the decision itself than about the banner behind the Lord's seat, its 4 old words hanging steady in the lamplight, while beneath it a room full of men argue their way, slowly and without drama, toward exactly the kind of considered readiness those words describe. Wind when the moment calls for speed, mountain when it calls for patience. Tonight, it seems, the mountain has won the argument, at least for now. The council breaks, with orders cascading outward through runners before the Lord has even fully risen from his seat. Watches doubled at the border posts. The garrison here stood to readiness rather than marched out tonight, and you file out along the wall with the other silent retainers, back into a yard gone properly dark now, torches already being lit along the ramparts for a night that every man crossing that yard understands will not look like an ordinary one. Supper this evening is eaten in the same common hall as breakfast, but almost nothing else about it matches the cold, quiet meal that began your day. The hall is fuller, men still in half their armour, helmets set down within reach on the mats beside them rather than racked away, and the rice tonight comes with a little more than the morning's plain bowl, a strip of dried fish, a portion held back, you suspect, in case tomorrow proves a day when no one has leisure to cook properly at all. Genzo sits across from you again, helmet at his elbow, and beside him Toyama, the older retainer who complained of his harvest shortfall at this same table this morning, eats with none of that morning's mild irritation, his whole attention turned instead to the door every time it opens. The talk at the table, once the first hungry silence breaks, turns the way talk always turns among men waiting on a night they cannot yet predict, toward duty and what it actually is that holds a household like this together, when rumour, not certainty, is all any of you have to go on. A younger retainer near the table's end asks, half joking, why any of you would march north on a lord's order into a fight none of you chose, and Toyama, older than the rest of you by 20 years and long past caring whether a younger man's question annoys him, answers it plainly. It is on, he says, a word every man at the table has heard since childhood, meaning the debt owed to a benefactor, the land, the rice, the roof over your family's heads, all of it given by this house before you had done anything at all to earn it. And it is Giri, the duty that answers that debt, not because a law demands it, though the domain's own code does demand it, but because a man who takes without ever repaying is not, in any sense anyone at this table would recognize, actually a man at all. Toyama does not deliver this as a lecture. He delivers it the way he complains about his harvest, matter of fact, half distracted, reaching for more rice as he speaks, and then, without much preamble, he tells the table something he does not often tell it, that he stood, 12 years ago now, at one of the earlier clashes near that same river crossing at Kawanakajima the rider mentioned this afternoon, close enough that he still remembers, more clearly than he remembers most of what happened last month, the particular sound a spear line makes when it meets another spear line at a dead run. He does not dress the memory up. He does not claim it was glorious. He says only that he came home from it, which more men on both sides that day did not, and that whatever glory the songs beyond the wall have since draped over that river crossing, what he actually remembers is being cold, frightened, and entirely certain, in the moment itself, that the debt he owed this house was the only thing keeping his feet moving forward instead of back. Somewhere beyond these walls, in villages scattered across Kai, whose names most of the men at this table could recite without thinking, wives and parents, who will not learn any of Tonight's news for days yet, are settling their own households for an ordinary night, unaware that the debt their sons and husbands owe this house has just shifted, however slightly, from the abstract into something that might soon be called upon in earnest. No runner will be sent to tell them anything unless the worst comes to pass. That, too, is part of the arrangement, unspoken but understood by every man in this hall. The household absorbs the uncertainty first, and spares its own families the weight of it for as long as the situation allows. No one at the table says much after that. It is not the kind of story that invites comment, and every man present, whatever his age or rank, understands well enough what it is doing at this particular table on this particular evening, reminding a room full of retainers, some of whom have never yet stood in a real spear line, what the debt they have spent all day discussing in the abstract actually costs when it comes due. You finish your rice, your fish, and sit a moment longer than you need to, listening to the ordinary sounds of the hall settling around Toyama's story, before Obata's voice carries in from the yard, calling the first watch of the night to its posts, and the meal, like everything else today, ends exactly on schedule, whatever else the night still has waiting. The watch you draw is the second of the night, the hours when the compound is at its darkest and quietest, and by every veteran's account, its most dangerous, and you walk the rampart above the outer moat, with a paper lantern in one hand, and the other resting loosely near your sword, boots finding the same worn path along the earthen bank that 100 night watches before yours have already worn smooth. Below you, the moat holds a thin skin of reflected torchlight from the gate towers, and beyond it the castle town lies mostly dark, a scattering of low lamps marking the household still awake, waiting the same way the garrison is waiting. On an ordinary night, this walk is close to peaceful, a slow circuit broken only by the challenge and countersign, exchanged with the watch coming the other way, and the occasional dog barking at nothing in the town below. Tonight it is something else, though nothing you can name concretely enough to report. Every shadow along the palisade seems to hold slightly longer than it should, before resolving into nothing more than a fence post or a low bush stirred by wind, and twice within the first hour you find yourself stopping mid-stride, lantern raised, certain you heard movement in the scrub below the rampart, only for the sound to settle, both times, into nothing more alarming than a small animal startled by your own footsteps. It is not superstition alone that keeps your attention this sharp. Every domain in this rivalry, Takeda and Wesugi both, employs men whose whole trade is exactly this kind of night, scouts and agents sent quietly across a rival's border to watch, to listen, and where the opportunity allows it, to do considerably more than watch, setting fires, spreading false orders, or simply vanishing again before a single sentry can raise the alarm. What such men are actually capable of, stripped of the exaggerated tales that already circulate about them even in your own lifetime, is likely more modest than the stories claim, patient observation more often than any dramatic infiltration. But modest or not, a garrison standing to readiness on a night like this one takes no comfort in modest. Standing a night watch well is its own trained skill, distinct from anything drilled on the spear ground in daylight, and new sentries are paired for their first several months with a veteran precisely so someone experienced can teach them the difference between a shadow that matters and a shadow that does not, how long it genuinely takes eyes to adjust fully to true darkness, and how a tired mind left alone too long in the quiet will reliably begin inventing threats where none exist. The watch rotation itself is kept deliberately short, a few hours at most before relief, because Obata has long argued, against the occasional suggestion that longer watches would need fewer men, that an exhausted sentry in his 6th hour is a greater danger to the wall than an alert one in his 2nd, a lesson learned, by most accounts, the hard way by some other domain's garrison rather than this one's own. You have heard Obata warn new sentries more than once that the two ways a wall actually falls are a determined assault it cannot hold, and a quiet hour when a tired watchman decides the shadows are nothing after all. A fellow retainer named Kanai, walking the opposite half of this same circuit, meets you at the rampart's midpoint the way the watch schedule requires, and you exchange the night's challenge and countersign in low voices before falling into step together for the short stretch where your 2 rounds overlap. Neither of you says much. There is little to say that the day has not already said more thoroughly than either of you could improve on, and the 2 of you walk in a silence that is comfortable in the way. Only shared duty makes a silence comfortable. Lanterns held a little higher than strictly necessary, eyes moving over ground you have. Both walked 100 uneventful nights before tonight. Somewhere below, in the dark scrub beyond the moat, an owl takes flight with a sudden clatter of wings that puts both your hands on your sword hilts before either of you has consciously decided to move, and for one long breath the 2 of you stand perfectly still, listening until the ordinary shape of the night reasserts itself and you both, without a word, lower your hands and continue walking. Nothing has happened. Nothing, you suspect, is likely to happen tonight at all. Not here, not on this stretch of wall, but the watch does not stand itself on the likelihood of nothing happening. It stands on the chance that it might, and that chance, tonight of all nights, is enough to keep every man on this rampart's attention exactly where it belongs, until the hour comes for the next watch to relieve you. Kanei's relief comes for the wall a little before the hour you expected, a young retainer you do not know well falling into step beside you with the countersign already ready on his lips, and you hand off the lantern and the circuit both with the same brief, wordless economy every changeover on this rampart has ever carried, and turn back at last toward the barracks row where this whole day began. The compound behind you has not stood down. Torches still burn along every rampart tower, and somewhere in the dark toward the stables you can hear grooms still moving horses that the garrison may or may not need before morning. But your own part in tonight's watch is finished, and whatever the coming hours ask of Tsutsujigasaki, they will, for a few hours yet, ask it of other men. Before the sleeping mat, though, there is one more small ritual the day still owes, and you keep it the way you have kept it most nights of your adult life, kneeling for a few moments before a small household shrine set in an alcove near the barracks entrance, its single lamp kept low and burning through the night by whichever man remembers to tend it. You are not, by temperament, a deeply devout man, no more than most of the retainers sharing this row, but the discipline itself, a few quiet breaths given over to a Mida Buddha of the Pure Land, or simply to the settled stillness the temple's Zen teaching calls for, is one you were taught as a boy and have never seen reason to abandon, least of all on a night when the whole compound has spent its hours weighing exactly how close death might have come without ever quite arriving. The prayer itself is short, a few repeated invocations of Amida's name that Pure Land teaching holds sufficient on their own to secure a peaceful road through whatever death eventually looks like, a simpler promise than the long demanding discipline of full Zen meditation practice, and one that suits, most nights, a tired retainer with more urgent things waiting for his attention than his own soul. Tonight the words come out of habit rather than particular fear, the same handful of syllables you have murmured at this same shrine more nights than you could count, and if they carry any different weight tonight than they carried last month, it is only because you let yourself, for the length of the prayer alone, actually consider what the night might have asked of you instead of what it did. It is not fear that sends you to the shrine tonight. It is habit, and habit, you have come to understand over 11 years of exactly this kind of day, is very often what carries a man through the hours fear alone would leave him unable to face. Back in the barracks row, the 6 other men who share your room are in various states of undress and readiness, armour set close at hand rather than racked properly away, in case the night still has something to ask of all of you before dawn. Genzo, already lying down, opens one eye as you settle onto your own mat and says nothing at all, which from Genzo has always counted as a full conversation. You unbuckle what remains of your own armour, set the pieces where your hands can find them in the dark without needing a lamp, and place the daisho, katana above wakizashi, back on the lacquered stand by the wall, exactly where they sat this same time last night. Exactly where they will sit, you trust without quite being able to prove it, tomorrow night as well. Nothing about tomorrow is decided yet. The rider brought a direction, not an outcome. The council set watches, not a battle. That is the truth of a samurai's calendar that no banner or blade quite captures on its own. Most days are ledgers and drill and a shared bowl of rice, and then, without warning, one day is not, and there is no way to tell in advance, waking in the cold dark the way you did this morning, which kind of day you are actually waking into. You live inside that uncertainty the way you live inside the cold, the way you live inside a debt to a lord you did not choose and duty you were never asked, only expected, to accept. It is simply the shape of the life, and tonight, as on every other night of your service, the shape holds. The bell somewhere beyond the wall tolls once, low, marking an hour you are too tired now to count, and you let your eyes close before the note has fully faded, the paired blades within reach on their stand, the lamp at the shrine burning low and steady in the dark, and the whole compound for one more night still standing. Step back from this one day, and a wider pattern comes into view, the same pattern that would have held whether the rider that afternoon had brought word of Uesugi banners or word of nothing at all. A samurai's life was never only the sword the age remembers him by. For every hour drilled on a training ground, another was spent bent over a ledger, or a brush and a Confucian text, or the reins of a horse bred for mountain ground rather than parade grounds, because the households that survived a century of open rivalry were the ones whose retainers could read a tax return as competently as they could hold a spear line. The blade sat at the hip all day. It was rarely, on most days, the thing a man's hands were actually doing. What bound the arrangement together across 100 barracks rows exactly like the one this day began in was not a single code carved in stone at some founding moment. It was accumulated debt owed to a lord who fed and housed a man before that man had done anything to earn it, answered by Jiri, A duty that generations of retainers chose to honour morning after morning less because a law demanded it than because the alternative made a man unrecognisable to himself. Historians still argue over how much of the Samuraya's later reputation for austere, unwavering loyalty was lived reality in years like this one, and how much was varnish added by more peaceful centuries looking back with admiration. What the record does support is simpler, and in its way more human. A great many ordinary men, none of them chosen for greatness, kept small disciplines, a stand for 2 blades, a crest owed to a house, a bell that measured the hours, and built out of that repetition something that held. North of Kai that same season, the contested ground around Shinano, the rivalry the riders report belonged to would grind on for years yet, neither house ever quite settling it for good, each side certain, the way every side in every such rivalry is certain, that its own cause was the one worth a retainer's whole life. The men on both banks of that river crossing were, in the ways that matter most for a single ordinary day like this one, barely different from each other at all. The same cold mornings, the same rice, the same debt to a lord neither man had chosen for himself. And in Kai on this particular night, none of that history has happened, yet. The watch is still standing, the armour is still laid close at hand. Somewhere in the barracks row, a lamp burns low at a household shrine, and a lacquered stand holds 2 blades in the dark, waiting, the way it waits every night, for a bell that has not yet decided what tomorrow's toll will mean.